Hi everyone, welcome to today's presentation all about PSAT scores and their role in college admission. I'm Kathy Hart, an educational consultant and test prep instructor with Score at the Top Learning Centers and Schools. We have some downloads available for you, although you don't need them in front of you to follow along with this presentation, but they will provide more information about some of the topics that I will cover today. You can go to www.scorewebinars.com to access these. All right, so let's get started with today's conversation. So first, let's look at the top 10 factors in college admission and where test scores fall into this list. And as you can see here, SAT and ACT scores round out that top three academic factors of college admissions, which include the rigor of your curriculum, your overall grades and upward trend in grades, and then SAT and ACT scores if you should choose to submit them. I'll talk about test optional in just a minute, but then you can see below those academic points, there are other factors, including letters of recommendations, activities, essays, among others. So let's talk a little bit about test optional and what it means. Now, many colleges in response to COVID-19 went test optional last fall and continue to be test optional this fall during this admission cycle, and might continue to be test optional going forward. When a school is test optional, it means that you, the student, have the choice to share your test scores with that college to be reviewed as part of your application or not. Now, test optional doesn't mean test blind. So if you do send scores, they will be used. If you don't send scores, they won't be used. The colleges will look more closely at those other parts of your application. And just to be aware that for schools that have gone test optional, admission tends to be more competitive, in part because there are more applications, and college admissions is going to look more closely at those other parts of your application without a set of test scores. But again, the decision is yours. You get to decide whether or not you are going to share your test scores. But just to be aware that in some circumstances, admission is more favorable to those who submit test scores than to those who do not. Now, as I mentioned earlier, colleges went test optional in response to the pandemic, whether this is permanent, temporary, if they're test optional, if they're test blind. The best resource to get this up-to-date information is on fairtest.org. They update this information daily. And since we do have many students from Florida in our audience, just a quick reminder that the Florida 12 universities, state universities, are not test optional and did not go test optional during the pandemic. Now you can see here on the chart in front of me that there is a more favorable admit rate for submitters than non-submitters for some schools. GW being the exception here, in part because they have been test optional since before the pandemic. The other schools that you see here all went test optional in response to the pandemic. Georgia Tech and University of Georgia are not test optional this year. They only had a one-year test optional policy. This year, this application cycle, they are requiring test scores. And we don't know if colleges are going to remain test optional. Colleges are still making this determination. And so regardless, it's always a good idea to prepare as though a school will still require tests. And even if a school stays test optional, just to know that strong scores are still a plus factor in college admissions. Now let's switch topics a little and talk about the PSAT. So the PSAT is a shorter, easier version of the SAT, and it is in fact a nickname Its full title is Preliminary SAT National Merit Scholarship Qualifying Tests. And we'll talk a little bit more about the National Merit Scholarship in a few moments. But the PSAT for juniors is the first step in the National Merit Scholarship process. And you may be asking, well, why should I take the PSAT? Of course, it is a very helpful tool in preparing for the SAT and even your ACT as well too. It gives you an idea of what to expect for future SAT scores. It can help you identify academic gaps. I'll show you how to do this when we look at the score report. It, of course, is the entry point for the National Merit Scholarship competition. And by virtue of taking the PSAT, you will start receiving lots of emails, lots of mailings from colleges, and it'll help you with your college research. So let's look at what PSAT scores are. So the PSAT and its big sister SAT share a common score scale, which you can see here on my screen, but the SAT has a higher scale score because it's a more difficult test. And you're going to notice there's a little bit of difference between the PSAT that's given to older students, so 10th and 11th graders, versus younger students, so 9th graders, and even some 8th graders. And since both of those versions, or those different versions of the PSAT are easier and shorter than the SAT, they're going to have a lower scale. Now, when you get your PSAT score report back, you're going to actually get 15 different scores and subscores, but the one that parents and students are going to look most closely at are going to be the 2 section scores, one of which is the combined reading writing score. The other is a math section score, and those 2 are added together to produce the total score. Now let's take a peek at the score report. And there's actually 2 different score reports that you will have access to. The first one is the summary report, which you should have received in your email, and you may actually be mailed a paper copy of this. You can go online to see this as well if you haven't looked at it. And your summary report is going to give you a nice overview of your PSAT performance. So let's take a look at some of those different performances. So if we look at the first page, we're going to see the total score. So that's the reading and writing plus the math. We're also going to see this percentile. Now I'm going to talk a little bit more about this percentile later in my presentation, but this percentile isn't what you think it would be. A lot of students see this and think, oh, that means my scores in this case, if I got this 960, I did better than 51% of the students taking the PSAT back in October. That's not the case. This percentile is actually a national representative sample, and it's comparing your scores with students nationally who may or may not have taken the PSAT. So it really isn't measuring your scores against other PSAT takers. You're going to see similar data for both the reading and writing section scores and the math section scores. So you're going to get that overall score along with that percentile. Then you're going to start seeing these benchmarks. Now, when you want to determine, oh, do I have any academic gaps? What can I do to get ready for college? These benchmarks are very useful in helping you determine this. So let's take a peek here. So I got a 520 on my reading and writing test, and I'm looking, oh yeah, my scores fall within the green. That means I'm on track to be ready to succeed in certain first-year college courses. Now, if I look at my math score, in fact falls in the red. That tells me I need to strengthen my math skills. Now, that could just simply be due to the fact that I haven't been taught those skills that I need yet, or maybe math is, something that I've always struggled in. And this tells me that I might want to do some additional tutoring for math, that when I'm going to take my SAT, I might want to focus on the math section, either with a tutor or as I'm preparing by myself. So this benchmarks give some nice insights into your college readiness. Now, you'll also see on the summary report those section scores broken down into test scores. So you're going to see each section is assigned a score of 8 to 38 for reading, writing, and math. And in order to get that total score, you'll see I add my reading and writing and add on a 0. I double my math score and also tack on a 0 as well too. And we call these scale scores, meaning your PSAT and SAT scores are based on your raw score. So your raw score is the total number correct for each section. And then depending on the difficulty of that test, that raw score is assigned a scale score, one of these test scores, and that in turn is added up to get that section score. You'll also see on your score report your National Merit Selection Index. Now, we're going to look at this a little bit more closely later on, but the selection index is going to be the benchmark. So you have to meet or exceed this selection index in order to qualify for the National Merit Scholarship competition. And this is how it's calculated here. You can either do double the sum of the reading, writing, and math test scores, or you can do 2 times the reading and writing section score added to the math section score and kill the final 0. And that's how the selection index is calculated. You're also going to start seeing some question level details on your summary report. So for instance, if I look at the reading test, I can see, oh, okay, there were 47 total questions. I answered 24 of them correctly, so a little better than half. I answered 23 incorrectly. And then I omitted 0, but oh yeah, look at over on the math. I omitted 1 question. Maybe I ran out of time. Maybe I didn't know how to do the problem. Just a little tip, because your scores are based on the number you get correct, there's no penalty or deduction for an incorrect answer, so never omit. Guess if you must. You're going to see further question level feedback as we dig a little deeper into the summary report. So first, you're going to see the correct answer for each question. Then you get to see your answer. So you'll see yes or no, you answered it correctly. And then you're going to see the difficulty. So you'll notice easy, medium, difficult for those types of questions. And this is another great piece of data to give you a little bit more insight on your academic readiness. You can look at the level of questions that you answered. If you missed a lot of easy questions, perhaps you rushed through the test. If you missed a lot of difficult questions, perhaps you haven't covered those concepts in your high school classes. So again, it gives you some nice insight onto what you need to do to further prepare for a future SAT. You can continue on to your online PSAT score report, which is going to give you even further information. And it'll also, you can actually link to your PSAT so you can see all the passages, all the problems, and you'll also receive access to Khan Academy for online test prep. So let's take a peek at what this online score report looks like. So again, you're going to see a lot of similar data that you saw on the summary report, including totals, total test score, section scores, benchmarks. You'll even see a predicted SAT range. Remember that nationally representative sample percentile I talked about earlier. You're actually going to see another percentile that is a little bit more accurate. So if you come down here and I look at this 960, right? So this tells me that my 960 falls into this 51st nationally representative sample percentile, and it compares my scores to typical US students. However, when I go to this next percentile, this one is a little bit more accurate. This one is actually comparing my scores to others, to other PSAT test takers. Now, it's not to the group of students, the cohort of students who took this last October PSAT. Rather, it's comparing it to students who have taken the PSAT in previous years. But still, this is a more accurate percentile, a more useful percentile. So if you're going to look at these percentiles, look at the PSAT user percentile versus this first one. Likewise, you're going to see the breakdown of test scores and the benchmarks along with those two percentiles. You'll start seeing these subscores. So here you're going to see a set of cross-section scores that'll give you a little insight again into your academic readiness. So say, for instance, I want to study science in college. Oh, my science analysis, my science reasoning is 23. And perhaps I might want to improve that if I'm intending to study science in college. So maybe do a little bit more work in my high school science classes. Again, you'll see those two percentiles for each of these cross-section scores. And then lastly, you are going to see 7 sub-scores. Now, what do these sub-scores mean? So these are really get deep into academic skills. So for instance, if we come over here and look at words in context. Okay, so my score for words in context was 7 out of 15. So I'm following in, my score is falling in the yellow, meaning it's not quite a college readiness. I'm not quite at college readiness level when it comes to words in context. So what does this tell me? If I'm preparing for an SAT, I might want to do some vocabulary building. I may wish to review those reading skills that help me find a word's definition just by using context clues. So this can, again, these subsection scores can give you some nice insight into areas that you need to focus on, not only to be prepared for a future SAT, but also to do better in your high school classes. You'll also see for each of these subscores, those two percentiles. All right, so now let's move into the question answers. So the questions overviews. So just like you saw with the summary, you're going to see the total number of questions, the number you'd answered correctly, the number you omitted, the number you answered incorrectly. And what's great here is now you can click on each question number and be brought to that section of the PSAT. So I go ahead and I click on question 2 in the reading section. And now I can see the question number 2. I can see that part of the passage that it's asking me to read to find the answer. So I look at the question in the context of the passage, the use of the word ruptured, line 14. So I'll circle that there. Serves mainly to. And then I can see all of the answer choices that I had to select from. Now I get to see, oh, I picked answer A, but the correct answer is in fact answer D. And what's really great about this online score report is it gives me not only the answer explanation, why choice D was correct, but also why the other answer choices weren't correct. So for a very diligent student, either doing test prep individually or perhaps working with a tutor, this is a great opportunity to go through every question that you missed and understand your errors and the skills that you need to work on in order to get these questions correct in either following PSAT or in a future SAT. Now let's talk a little bit about the National Merit Scholarship. So here's just a quick review of how this selection index is computed. And then you can see for Florida students graduating this spring, so class of 2022, the National Merit cutoff was 217. So if you got that selection index or higher, you were qualified for the National Merit Scholarship competition. And just to give you a little overview of what this process looks like. So in your junior year, you and about 1.5 million other juniors are taking your PSAT. And in April, you'll find out from your high school if you qualify for recognition. So only about 50,000 do. In the fall of your senior year, a little more than half of those students will be notified that they are commended students. This is an honor. You want to put this on your college applications, but you're done as in terms of the competition. 16,000 of that 50,000 have been notified that they're semifinalists, and they will go on through the competition. And in March, a little bit more than half of those 16,000 semifinalists will be awarded a merit scholarship. You can go to nationalmerit.org to find out more details about the scholarship, about the competition, about the qualifications, and the other steps that you need to take throughout the process. Now let's compare the PSAT and the SAT. So the PSAT is made up of previous SAT questions. It is shorter, it is less difficult, it has a slightly lower scale when it comes to scoring. And let's look at how they compare. So you're going to notice the order of the sections is going to be the same for both. Always begins with reading, writing and language, and then the two math sections. The SAT you're going to see for the reading has a few more questions and you get 5 more minutes. For the math, I have a few more questions. And in the case of the final math section, which is the one in which you can use a calculator, you actually get 10 more minutes. We looked at the scales earlier in the presentation, but you can see here that the SAT is going to have a slightly higher score scale because it is a more difficult and longer test. And both tests, both the PSAT and SAT, are testing the same skills. So critical reading, writing, math problem solving. And just quickly, when we're talking about writing on the PSAT and on the SAT, we're talking about multiple choice grammar and revision questions. The PSAT has never had an essay component. The SAT used to have an optional free write essay, which they did away with this past spring, so spring of 2021. So colleges are not going to see your PSAT results, but the PSAT is useful because it can help you predict your future SAT success. And thinking back to that list of the top 10 most important factors in college admission, don't forget the SAT and ACT, if you send them, again, depending on if the school's test optional or not, are going to be one of the top academic factors in determining college admissions. So let's look a little bit more at how the role that SAT and ACT also play in other parts of college admissions. So in addition to getting admitted, SAT and ACT can also impact the level of need-based financial aid that you receive. So for some schools, if you have a higher SAT or ACT, you may receive more need-based funding. For talent-based scholarships, for some of those scholarships, sometimes an SAT and ACT is required, even if a school is test optional. In other cases, a higher SAT or ACT score might mean, again, that you might receive more merit-based funding or talent-based funding. Some students who are interested in honors programs might find that some of those colleges require an SAT or ACT in order to be admitted for an honors program, or might find that the SAT or ACT improves your chances of getting into an honors program. And then an SAT and ACT can also be used to place you in freshman classes. So as part of your first year advising, your SAT reading and writing might determine which level of English class you're going to take. Your math score may determine which math class you are going to start in. And if you're curious, you can take a peek at the national average scores from the students who took this test last year, and you can compare your current scores with those to see where you stack up in terms of the national average. And you're going to notice that scores go up year to year. So they're lower in 8th grade, and then they jump up by the time students reach 11th grade. For students interested in our Florida State universities, here are some admission statistics showing you the mid 50% SAT and the mid 50% ACT for students starting this fall. So this fall's first year students. These were the averages in the 50% range. But don't forget, 25% of admitted students scored higher and 25% of students scored lower. You can also see now some admission statistics from some popular national universities, colleges, and universities, and this was compiled from US News and World Report, the most recent edition, which came out just a couple months prior to me making this recording. And if you just look across the top, if we look at American, this is Americans' overall admit rate. This is the mid-range, again, that mid 50% of their SAT scores. And this is their mid 50% of their ACT scores. And you can find all of this information, by the way, either looking at US News and World Report, which gathers all this data, or you can also go to a college's admissions site. If you look up admitted student profile, you can see that information. It's most colleges make it pretty easy to access. Of course, now the question remains, now that you have your PSAT scores, is deciding which tests do I take? Do I take the SAT? Do I take the ACT? And just to be aware that colleges treat both tests exactly the same. There's no preference for one over the other. So really, juniors and even younger students, it's really up to you to determine which direction you're going to go when it comes to testing. Some students who have done well on the PSAT, who like that format, might gravitate towards taking the SAT in the future. Other students might be interested in trying an ACT. And some students might decide that standardized testing is challenging for them, and they may choose the test optional route. So lots of good options there. Now, when you're looking at comparing, well, which one do I take, the SAT or ACT? A couple different ways you can decide. Certainly you have your PSAT scores now. You may be taking a December ACT. You might be taking a February ACT. You can compare your PSAT scores to your ACT scores, consider the overall testing experience, and decide that way. You can certainly look at a concordance or comparison chart. We also offer free simulations monthly for the SAT or ACT. They are real previously released tests. So it gives you a real testing experience in a very low risk environment. And we also offer, for a small fee, an SAT, ACT decision plan. And at the end of this presentation, I'm going to put our contact information on the screen. So if you're interested in learning more information about these, you're welcome to give us a call. Now, let's start thinking about a good test schedule. So for my juniors, you have your PSAT scores now. If you're going to take the ACT, you want to think about taking it twice in the spring of your junior year. So you can see there are 4 testing dates from February to July. Now, some of those testing dates give you the option of taking the test, and then for a little extra for your testing fee, you'll receive the TIR. So this gives you a chance to, kind of like with your PSAT that we looked at, you'll get a copy of your test, you'll get a copy of the answer key, you'll get to compare your answers to the correct ones, and this can be a very helpful tool for preparing for a future ACT. Now, let's say you're taking the SAT path, right? So likely you will be taking a school day SAT at the beginning of March. These are the national testing dates up on my screen. And you can see for 2 of those, the March and May, you can access the question and answer service. So same thing, you'll get a copy of your test, a copy of your answers, and an answer key as well. Just like with the ACT, it's a good idea to take a SAT a couple of times spring of your junior year, and you still have time to test again in the fall of your senior year if you still need higher scores. Now, some sophomores might be eager to get started with testing, And if you're thinking about the ACT, again, you have the same options for test dates. A lot of sophomores that we work with like to take it at the end of their sophomore year. And the June test is another test that does offer, it's one of the tests that in which you can get the test information released. And then if you're thinking about taking an SAT, it's a good idea to wait until the start of your junior year and prepping for it over the summer. And of course, if you're starting testing a little bit on the early end, you'll have plenty of time to take the test again throughout your junior year in order to get the scores that you need. Now, another question that comes up is, I've taken these tests, how do I get my scores to the colleges? How do I do this? So a few things to consider. So first of all, you want to wait until you actually know what your scores are before you send them to colleges. So don't send your results until you actually have them in hand. And there's two ways to send them. Many colleges still require an official score report. So you go into SAT or ACT's website and you send scores that way. More and more colleges are moving over to the self-reporting model, which means you can self-report your scores on your application, or you can self-report them on what's called an applicant portal, which is a website you have access to after you filed your application with a college. So those are the two most common ways to self-report your test scores. And another question that comes up is, do I have to send all of my scores? Do I only send the best? What's a super score? So you can see here three options that colleges will give you. Some colleges will say, send us your best set of scores from a single test sitting. Some colleges will ask you to send all test scores from all sittings. Other colleges will ask you to send your best score sets. And this is known as score choice. And colleges that are going to take all scores or that might ask you to pick your best sets of scores many times will super score. So super scoring means that colleges will look at those section scores from different test dates. So let's say I take the SAT in March and I get a 700 on my reading, but I do a little lower on math. Then I take the SAT again in May and I do great on my math. I get a 700 on my math, but maybe my reading drops slightly. So for a college that super scores, they'll look at my 700 from my March test in reading, my 700 from my math test in May, and they'll combine those two for my new super score of 1400. So it's a nice option. And then of course, don't forget for test optional colleges, the choice to send scores is absolutely yours. And regardless of whether you're going to take an SAT or an ACT, you'll absolutely want to prepare before taking those tests. Most students don't do any preparation for the PSAT because it is a preliminary, a practice test, but students should prepare for SAT or ACT. And just some of the things that you might want to consider when you're doing your test preparation is making sure you're using previously released tests, that you're timing and scoring your tests, that you're working with someone that's going to build a strong relationship with you, help you out with other academic subjects. Of course, we would be honored if you consider us for your test prep. We have all sorts of different ways that we work with students for test prep, and we've been doing virtual test prep since well before the pandemic. So it's a great way to connect at your convenience. Also, now is a great time to start planning for college. Juniors and younger students as well too. So start looking at colleges on your list, colleges of interest. Look at those freshman class profiles and see what are those mid 50% GPAs, test scores. Take a look at your own test scores. Where do you need to improve? Look at some of those academic gaps that you might want to fill in based on those benchmarks that we looked at from the PSAT score report. Look at your GPA. Look at your curriculum. Are you challenging yourself when it comes to your class schedule? Look at those activities. Do you need to build up some activity involvement? And of course, we're here to help you with all of your college counseling, test prep, and tutoring needs. All right, so as we come to the end of this presentation, just a few things to remind you of. So we are going to be doing 2 live interactive PSAT review webinars coming up with our expert test prep tutors. The reading and writing PSAT review will be on December 14th at 6:30. And then the math review will be on December 9th at 6:30. Again, these will be live, they will be interactive. The tutor will be going over this October PSAT. So bring your questions. You can sign up for this. It's free, of course, at scorewebinars.com. Juniors who are going to be taking the March SAT, we have an SAT workshop coming up at Suncoast High School, but it's open to all students, and it is 7 Saturday morning sessions. If you're interested, you can sign up at suncoasttestprep.com, and it'll be virtual or in person, depending on the pandemic, of course. Later on in the summer, early fall, we host several college admissions boot camps. And for more information, you can sign up at scorebootcamp.com just to receive some information. And we have many, many recordings available that go deeper into some of the topics that I discussed earlier. For interest, for example, if you want to learn more about test optional admissions or how college admissions changed in response to COVID-19, we have some great webinars available on both of those subjects. So go to scorewebinars.com. And we always welcome you to share with your friends about us. And since this is a recorded presentation, unfortunately, I am not taking any live questions, but if you do have any for me, you may reach out to me directly. My email is heart, H-A-R-T, at scoreatt.com. And you can also see the numbers for all of our learning centers at the bottom of the screen here. So if you have any interest in our test simulations or our testing decision plans or more questions about tutoring, etc., please feel free to reach out. Well, thank you all so very much for your time and attention. Stay safe, stay healthy, and have a wonderful day. Thank you so much.